When the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its highly anticipated report on global warming in early August, U.N Secretary-General António Guterres declared it nothing less than a code red for humanity, insisting that the alarm bells are deafening and the evidence is irrefutable. Greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel burning and deforestation are choking our planet and putting billions of people at immediate risk. Guterres' code red language was echoed by the press and activists, some of whom called humanity guilty as hell of climate crimes. Others prophesied that the climate news is only going to get worse and that the choice before us was immediately passing the Green New Deal or death. Roger Pielke Jr., a professor of environmental studies at the University of Colorado, writes that such reactions are not only wrong, but irresponsible. Pielke believes that temperatures are rising in response to human activity, but that the alarmism that dominates the discussion is counterproductive. Nowhere does the IPCC report say that billions of people are at immediate risk, he says, stressing the gap between what's actually in the report and the highly politicized way we discuss climate change. Reason talked with Pielke about why apocalyptic scenarios about temperature change are severely mistaken, how the planet is getting more hospitable to human life, and how ongoing incremental improvements in energy technologies will almost certainly lead to a brighter, cleaner future for all. Roger Pielke Jr., thanks for talking to Reason.
Nick, it's great to be here.
Okay, so in a response to the IPCC report that dropped recently, you wrote that this prompted a flurry of interpretations and yes, spin. And I'm quoting you. You say the Secretary General of the United Nations warned of, and you're quoting him now, a code red for humanity. The alarm bells are deafening, and the evidence is irrefutable. Greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel burning and deforestation are choking our planet and putting billions of people at immediate risk. You respond to this at your Substack saying, not only is this wrong, it is irresponsible. Let's start with what's wrong with that. How is what the Secretary General of the UN, the organization that oversees the IPCC, what is he getting wrong?
Yeah, the part of that I think is most troubling is the fear-inducing statement that billions of people around the world are at immediate risk. The reality is, and according to statistics kept by the UN, the world is actually much safer a place than it has been in the past when it comes to extreme weather and climate. Vulnerability has gone down dramatically.
Can you put some numbers or kind of facts on that? When you say, because everybody, kind of agrees, unless you deny global warming, temperatures have gone up. You hear a lot of stories about extreme weather events. We'll get into that in a little bit. Yep. But when you say the planet is, people are at less risk, it means fewer people are dying from weather-related events.
Yeah, I mean, think of it like this. In the 1920s, 100 years ago, let's say there's 2 billion people on the planet and millions of people died from extreme weather and climate events. Millions, literally. Today, there's 7 to 8 billion people on the planet. And, every death is a tragedy, of course, but we see thousands of deaths from extreme weather and climate. Going from millions to thousands is a drop, of several orders of magnitude. It is one of the greatest scientific, technological, and policy success stories of humanity in the last century. So to claim that billions of people are at immediate risk is simply scientifically, empirically, factually incorrect.
Okay. What else is wrong in the UN Secretary General's announcement of a code red for humanity?
Yeah, I think the idea that an IPCC report is some sort of a threshold or announcing new information. The reality is the IPCC, which is an important institution, it's been around for more than 3 decades. If it didn't exist, we'd have to recreate it. But its message to policymakers for that time has been largely solid and consistent over that time. And its job is to assess a sprawling, vast scientific literature, but there's really nothing new there. So and I know, politicians and policymakers like to use reports as a newsworthy event to try to, motivate this or that action. But the idea that the IPCC report, when it came out, was giving new information that we didn't have the day before, or honestly, 10 years ago or 20 years ago. It's put finer points and more precision and there's new science, of course, but the core messages haven't changed. So the idea advanced by policymakers that this, all right, finally, this report is the trigger, I think it's a misleading interpretation of how science actually works.
Is that also true of the report, the IPCC report or update that came out in the fall of 2018, which gave rise to the to the mantra or the trope that we have 12 years to fix the planet's climate, otherwise we're done. This was popularized by people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Greta Thunberg, but also Joe Biden, when he was running for president, talked about how we only have X number of years to go before we lose the planet.
Yeah, I mean, deadlineism, it's not unique to climate change, certainly. And it's a common trope in political debates to try to motivate people to action. Climate change is particularly difficult because it's not particularly amenable to deadlineism. The climate is changing. We're responsible, and it's incremental. It's not a sudden threshold type issue. There is some science about tipping points and so on, but the reality is, and we just look back over the last 30 years. That's a good metric for how the next 30 years are going to be. So the IPCC has generally been responsible in not stating deadlines like you hear politicians and advocates state, but the IPCC does sometimes lend itself to that interpretation. So that 12 years, until the end of time from the 1.5 degree report, that was a creation of the media advocates. Citing the IPCC. The IPCC never said, we have 10 years till catastrophe or whatever.
Right. And I mean, part of that, just to get a sense of, part of it is that there's a belief or that's widespread among activists as well as politicians and people in the media, that it's kind of like the environment is kind of like cooking an egg, where at a certain point, the egg, the white gets, solidifies and it turns white, and the yolk gets cooked, and like it can't be uncooked. That is kind of the wrong analogy, right, for the environment. There isn't a point, at least from the science, where you can say, okay, now we're done. It's just more that there's a ramp up, right, or incremental change.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a Time magazine cover with an egg and a frying pan that your comments reminded me of. But both climate change and successful climate policy are long-term incremental effects. If you look at sea level rise is not something that, oh my gosh, we're going to wake up tomorrow and there's a meter more ocean out there. It's millimeters per year, basically forever. And so climate policy, decarbonizing the economy, is not something that, we wake up tomorrow and all of a sudden, there's a nuclear power plant on every corner. It's incremental. It's steady, slow change. The analogy I often use, it's like the advance in human lifespans. Right? It doesn't happen overnight. It's a decades, even century-long process. So I think this is one of the challenges with deadlineism, is that in the context of climate change, we don't have deadlines for the effects of climate change. We don't have deadlines for successful climate policy, and that's really hard to square with the science when advocates keep pushing for, we have 100 days, we have 12 months, we have 12 years, and so on.
So does the science refute the kind of hockey stick paradigm that, you're going along and like things are going up a little bit, and then suddenly they shoot way up, that people like Michael Mann, the scientist, or Al Gore, and it seems like a million years ago, but in talking about an inconvenient truth, whether it's the book or the movie, that hockey stick paradigm is just not accurate. Is that safe to say?
Well, I mean, it depends what you mean by the paradigm. Fortunately or unfortunately, I'm not, an expert in the, paleoclimate world. And so that's, a very long-term perspective. And yeah, and there's been debates about the proper use of, hockey stick-like graphs. There's one that appears, it's the first graph in the summary for policymakers in the current IPCC report. But I think, where it has relevance is in the context of extreme events. The idea that we're seeing an abrupt change in the number of hurricanes or the number of floods, that marks a departure from what we've seen in the past. And that's not supported by the evidence.
So what is the evidence then? Say, with things like hurricanes and, and storms like that, what is going on?
Yeah, the first thing for people to understand is that extreme weather is a big category. It's got a lot of things in it. It's a little bit like disease, right? We wouldn't talk about disease in general. What we do is we talk about heart disease or cancer or COVID, and we have treatments specific to disease. So the IPCC actually has done a very nice job in summarizing the evidence and the literature on a wide range of extreme events. And I mean, just to pick several, heat waves are one where the IPCC has explained that we've seen an increase in the number of heat waves, and they have attributed, that means that they have, determined that the causality behind that increase in heat waves to some significant degree is human. And of course, there's factors like urbanization and so on that also contribute to heat wave. Extreme precipitation is another one. The IPCC has identified an upwards trend in some places around the world and attributed that to human causes. The IPCC is also very explicit that extreme precipitation is not necessarily the same thing as flooding. There's a lot of reasons for that. But if you want to look at trends in flooding, look at flooding. And the IPCC very responsibly has said, if you look around the world in certain places and, there's uptrends and downtrends, but there's no overall signal. There's nothing overall to attribute to human causes. Hurricanes, which is, the name for the broader category, tropical cyclones, the IPCC, again, very responsibly says on a century timescale, looking back on planet Earth, they don't detect trends. It's very hard to detect trends. And if it's hard to detect trends, they can't be very large.
Is that, to go back, so fewer people are dying from weather events like hurricanes or, tsunamis or whatever, but there's more damage caused by hurricanes, right? Because we have built up along coasts and things like that? Or is that a source of confusion then?
Yeah, there's a lot of confusion. So the decline in deaths is really easy for people to see and to understand because it's sharp, going way down, and it's down both in absolute numbers, but also in terms of the proportion of people on the planet. Economic damage is a little bit more complicated and difficult to understand because the absolute costs of damage is going up. There's no doubt about it. And why is it going up? Because we have more buildings, we have more property, we have more wealth, we have more stuff that's exposed to extreme weather or hurricanes, but whatever it happens to be. So we would expect as we get wealthier that we're going to see an absolute increase in costs. What you can do though is you can say, well, let's see how damage has increased as a proportion of our wealth. And given that, and we do this all the time in all sorts of contexts, and usually GDP is in the denominator, but there's more sophisticated ways to look at disaster losses. But once we do that, we actually see, and this is, there's a large literature, this shouldn't be particularly controversial, that the cost of extreme weather events and climate events has actually gone down as a proportion of our wealth. That's fantastic news. And the reason is we're less vulnerable than we used to be. We know how to build structures that can withstand extreme weather. And if you look around the world, particularly in poor countries or countries that used to be poor, the decline in vulnerability is just remarkable. It's a great scientific success story.
And that means that people are less likely to die because of, a hurricane, a flood, a landslide, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of moving parts in risk. But among them are weather forecasts and warnings, and the ability for people to actually respond when they hear a forecast or a warning. I mean, if you take a look at the Indian Ocean basin, for example, at Bangladesh and India, in the 1960s, routinely tens of thousands of people would die when a cyclone hit, often unwarned, and people didn't get out of the way. Today, fortunately, tens, maybe hundreds might die in an event that would have been tens of thousands, 50 years ago. It's a remarkable success story. I can't even overstate how great this application of science and technology has actually been. It's like, it's similar to vaccination, right? It's most people don't know what the world looked like before we had vaccines, and most people don't know what the world looked like before we had this great reduction in vulnerability to weather events.
In the IPCC report, you and in your critique of it, you talk about how they lay out a bunch of different scenarios, and there's essentially 5 major scenarios. Can you talk about the range of them, and then the way in which the authors of the report either do or don't assign probabilities of that this one scenario is going to be the outcome? What's the range of scenarios, and how seriously should we take different scenarios?
Yeah, so scenario planning is a really important tool for policy analysis. It goes back to the 1960s, and the reason why we use scenarios is that the long-term future is basically unpredictable. And we've learned this over and over. Even aspects of the near-term future are unpredictable. So for 30 years since the IPCC started, it has used scenarios to look into how climate change might manifest itself decades and towards the end of the century and even longer. To produce those scenarios, you need to know something about, well, how many people are going to be on the planet? What's our economy going to look like? What kind of energy sources are we going to use? How efficient will we be? Many of these variables are very difficult or impossible to predict. So the IPCC has used a range, which makes a lot of sense. There's been a debate in the IPCC and in the community. Do we want to have a scenario that is our best guess as to where we're going in the future? Or do we just want to present them as, hey, here's a whole bunch of plausible futures. Policymakers, you can figure out, how you want to deal with that. The advantage of having a best guess scenario is that you can use that for things like cost benefit analysis or cost effectiveness. You can say, well, if this is where we're headed and we alter course, what are the economic benefits of doing so? And that can be traced to cost benefit analysis, which goes back to the 1980s. The problem is, and I think you can see this right away, is if we can't predict the future, identifying a best guess is a pretty risky enterprise, because we're likely to be wrong in our best guess. We've always seen that. So the IPCC has bounced back and forth between these different approaches. In its recent report, before the current one, 2013, it did identify a scenario as what I call a reference scenario, the best guess, often also called business as usual. And the current report abandoned that approach. And so this makes it, I think, difficult for people to understand, what the report's actually saying, because if you provide a range, people will interpret that as some sort of set of likelihoods. And media and advocacy loves to focus at the top of the range. And so my critique with colleagues, we publish this in the literature, is that the IPCC, its upper end scenarios are simply no longer can be considered plausible.
What are the upper end scenarios? In terms by 2050 or 2100, what are they predicting in terms of increase in temperature and attendant effects?
Yeah, so the upper end scenarios, and they have technical names that are attached to them, project something like a 4 to 5 degrees Celsius temperature change by 2100. Dramatic climate effects. And to contrast that with more plausible scenarios that are, the IPCC calls intermediate scenarios, these are more like 3 degrees Celsius. I think the best the best guess for the intermediate scenario of the current IPCC is 2.7 degrees. So it's something like, almost twice as much warming overall by 2100. These scenarios are implausible, and the short story is they're grounded in socioeconomic assumptions that it's not our planet. So, for example, one of the assumptions of these extreme scenarios is that we are going to abandon all of our energy sources except coal. We're going to replace wind and solar and nuclear and gas and even gasoline with coal. And we're going to consume more than 6 times per person the amount of coal in 2100 than we do today.
Right. And that's implausible, partly because you've written and others have noted that we probably have either reached the peak use of coal or we're just about to, and it's actually going to be declining.
Yeah, the scholar who really has done the most work on this is my colleague Justin Ritchie in British Columbia. And he identified an assumption of the scenarios, goes back to the 1990s, that assumed that the assumption in the scenario is that we're going to learn how to extract fossil fuels, and by extracting them, it's going to be cheaper and easier, and it's going to be like a avalanche going down a hill. We're just going to do more and more and more of it. It's called learning by doing. That's not how things have panned out. And unfortunately for the IPCC and for climate policy, that assumption has been baked into the scenarios, really all of the scenarios that underpin what ultimately is really, really important climate modeling work and so on, projecting the future. The result is we get these upper end scenarios that once were deemed the most probable, that have been the focus of a lot of policy debate, of advocacy. And the problem is they project a future that is not one that we're headed to. We can say pretty confidently.
Can we say it's possible but very unlikely? I mean, it's conceivable, right? But
yeah, I mean, I think when we do scenario planning, we certainly want to do what are called exploratory scenarios, right? So it would be perfectly reasonable for a scientist to say, what would happen if an asteroid like the one that apparently took care of the dinosaurs hit the Earth in 2030? That's very different than saying, hey, an asteroid's going to hit the Earth in 2030. And so, yes, it's really important. And, climate modelers will tell you, and they tell me all the time, I really like extreme scenarios because that helps me to separate a signal of greenhouse gas forcing, for example, from the noise of natural variability. Great, that makes a lot of sense. The problem is when we conflate exploratory extreme scenarios with plausibility or probability, a little bit like the asteroid example.
So what out of those scenarios that are kind of put forth in the IPCC report, they don't ascribe particular likelihoods, right? Like they don't say, this one is 80% likely to come true. This one is 5% or anything.
Right.
Right. And you hail that as a sign of progress.
Yes, because in the previous report, the 2013 report, there was a scenario identified as a reference, the most likely scenario, which was the most extreme. In the current report, they very explicitly say we don't assign likelihoods to these different scenarios. The problem is when you go into the meat of the report, not all scenarios are treated equally.
Right. And you point out in a chart where you've referenced that the number of references to the more extreme scenarios than to the more moderate or the, I guess, more optimistic ones. What did you find there?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the report and you just do a simple, where's the focus of attention? Where are they summarizing the literature? More than half of the mentions of scenarios are to implausible extreme scenarios. So it has this built in, and there's a long history here. And it is, I think it's an accurate reflection of the scientific literature that's out there. There is an overwhelming emphasis on the extreme implausible scenarios. The problem is this is a report for policymakers, and it gives the impression that, again, even without saying it up front, that this is where the world is headed, or the interpretation that you get from looking at a report with 50% extreme scenarios is a built-in catastrophe bias, I guess I would call it in the report.
Is that, is it because the scientists putting it together, the researchers putting this together, believe that? Or, I mean, how is there bias among researchers to, kind of gravitate towards extreme scenarios?
Yeah, and I would, there is definitely a bias, and it's not, would hate to disappoint people, but it's not a political bias, and it's not an advocacy bias. It's a bias that, for the purposes of climate modeling, extreme scenarios are really useful. They tell you something about the science, and this is where something went wrong. There was a short circuit in the IPCC process, in the development and prioritization of the scenarios that underpin a lot of climate research. Decisions were made literally 10, 15 years ago about these scenarios, apparently with no assessment of policy relevance or likelihood. So we find ourselves in 2021 with this vast literature, this incredible report that hundreds of scientists spent time on, and the foundation that it's built on, these scenarios, never underwent evaluation for plausibility or probability. So in one sense, it's not surprising then that whatever cultural and scientific factors went into the selection and prioritization of the scenarios, we can explain it, but it's not surprising then that the report isn't as policy focused as we might hope it would be in 2021, leading to a media discussion, advocacy that centers on these extreme scenarios that are highly improbable.
So now we're getting towards that notion that this report is, or the Secretary General's characterization of it is not only wrong but is irresponsible. It's kind of the report. I mean, is it right to say the report is somewhat irresponsible then, or is it really our treatment of it?
I mean, it's both. I mean, the working. So the IPCC has three working groups. The first one, which this report, is the physical science of climate change. The second one is impacts, and the third is economics. And I've had discussions with IPCC leaders and folks, in the past week, and I'm routinely told, "Hey, it's not our job in working group one to assess scenarios, to evaluate their likelihood or probability." And for me, that's that's a problem for the IPCC. It's a problem for all of us because it lends itself to an uncorrectable set of misinterpretations. So when the head of the UN says it's code red for humanity, and that's not correct. That's not what the IPCC says. But if you look at the report and you say, "Oh my gosh, look at all these extreme scenarios," we're in a situation where part of the IPCC's job is to evaluate the literature. And so it would have been much more helpful for the world if the IPCC had an ability to say, "All right, we're going to ring fence these extreme implausible scenarios. We'll put them in a chapter called exploratory scenarios," something like that. It says up front in the report, these extreme scenarios are, its language is low likelihood, and then it ignores that throughout the report.
So what are the in your kind of analysis or in the report itself, what is the most likely scenario, or the more likely scenarios? Where will we be in 2100, and what will that mean for our day-to-day life? Well, we're not going to be at 5 or 7 degrees hotter Celsius. Where are we going to be, and what will that mean?
Yeah, so it's important. I mean, we have to distinguish between how much CO2 emissions are going to be put out, and then what's the corresponding temperature. There's still scenarios where we could have high temperature change or large climate change for reasons independent of carbon dioxide emissions. So, and unfortunately, those scenarios aren't present in the current report. But assessments. So the first thing to say is prediction is a mug's game. It's anyone who thinks they can tell you what the world's going to look like in 2100, they're probably selling you something. But we can do some things, and there are some quantitative ways to evaluate scenarios. And one of the things we've done is, if you take the scenarios that were produced several decades ago, they project out to 2100. They give us, now 15 or 20 years of data on how the world has actually evolved for 20% of the century. So we can take the evidence from the real world and say, all right, let's match that up with this massive body of scenarios. The IPCC in its 2013 report has almost 1,200 scenarios. So we can say, all right, of those 1,200 scenarios, which ones best match what's happened in the last 20 years? And so we've done that. And so we can throw out, literally, 700 or 900 scenarios, depending on how closely you want it to match. Then we can say, well, what do those scenarios project into the future, after 2100? And what we get when we take that subset that looks like the real world so far, they project about 2.2 degrees warming by 2100. And this is very much in line with a lot of the physical sciences literature and other work looking at current policies and projecting that forward. It's still climate change. The problem doesn't go away. It doesn't become invisible. But what it does say is that, yeah, these extreme scenarios are really implausible. It also says that the 3-degree projection that now is people are talking about is likely a worst case scenario, not a central tendency. And also, I guess I'll say that if our goal is to limit climate change to a 2-degree change or even 1.5 degree, we're actually in better position than we thought we would have been 10 or 15 years ago. And that's good news.
Why is 1.5 or 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees? Why people seem to catch on these numbers? Is there anything magic or particular in those figures, or is it just that's what people latch on to?
It's the nature of politics and policy to focus on simple targets and timetables. The 2-degree temperature target comes from work of William Nordhaus, in particular, an economist, won the Nobel Prize in the 1970s, who looked at earlier climatological research focused on temperatures in central England. And that the discovery there was that, well, historically temperatures fluctuated to plus or minus 1 degree from some baseline. So Nordhaus said, well, it looks like 2 degrees is the threshold within which humanity can operate. Nice round number. And it kind of propagated through the literature and eventually became adopted as a target. It was realized at some point that 2 degrees was a threshold the world would exceed decades into the future. It did not lend itself to targets and timetables sort of approaches. And so 1.5 degrees, which is right, on the horizon, was proposed as part of the Paris Agreement. And it was, more an aspirational target, but that lends itself, much more to immediate targets and timetables sort of discussion. So the answer is, yeah, there's a pseudo-scientific, background to it, but it's much more arbitrary in terms of supporting policy discussions.
Is part of the climate change discussion and the way to deal with it, and I want to get into that in a minute, but is part of it, it seems like people are coming at it with very different kind of end states or presumptions, where it's, the main thing is to keep the global temperature, the average mean temperature at or below a certain level. That's one camp. And so everything has to go towards that. And then the other, and you've kind of articulated this, where, the real measure is, are we able to support more or fewer people on the planet, or more or fewer people dying because of weather? Is that part of what's going on here, is that people are talking past each other?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, climate change, and Mike Hume, who's a researcher at Cambridge, has written a wonderful book called Why We Disagree About Climate Change. But climate change has developed into, it's sort of like a Christmas tree, and everybody gets to hang their ornament on it. And it really now encompasses discussions of all of human and ecological status of the planet. And yes, for some people, they boil it down to a simple temperature target. For others, it's about energy access and justice around the world. For others, as you say, it's about vulnerability and exposure and risk. For still others, it's about particulate pollution. I mean, we could go on and on and on. And so it is a sprawling, encompassing topic that we really have to take apart if we want to talk about specific policies. It is a symbol. Climate change is a symbol.
Is it wrong to suggest, and this may be far outside your area of expertise or interest, but has it become, and I don't mean this pejoratively, but almost a theological debate where it's really about our relationship to to this life and the afterlife, or what of the future. And as a result, we're all bringing very different conceptions of what is good and just and proper. And as a result, it's hard to, even have meaningful conversations with people that you disagree with.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I also think that has been the tenor of environmental debates and discussions, going back decades and longer. Even if we go back to the population resources debate of the 70s, with the carrying capacity of the earth and so on. Ultimately, the debates we have about climate change are debates about how we want as a global community to go into the future, and with all of the complexities and all the baggage and all the politics and all that. So of course it is. And how could it not be? But it does make it very difficult to have healthy, productive debates, because policymaking is precise, it's incremental, it occurs in different places on different scales. And policymaking is not in response to big global views about how we should go into the future. It's very precise. So there is that disconnect that makes it difficult.
So let's talk a little bit about what your ideas about what are the best ways to deal with climate change. And you unambiguously, you believe that climate change is happening, and that, human activity is a major cause of it. The IPCC report says, over the past 50 years, there has been a significant increase in temperatures, and going back to the mid 19th century, a lot of it has happened since 1970. That is primarily, that's a function of human activity, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So
and I think, let me just say, the IPCC reports, we can criticize them, and they can do better and they should do better. But over the last 30 years, they provide a really important touchstone for the core findings of climate science that haven't changed. So,
yeah. And I guess one of the things, and this is where it gets difficult, and in your work, you do some stuff for kind of lay readers at your Substack and in the popular press, and then there's technical debate. So, there's a level of of kind of expertise that you can find in your work and other people's work. But then what are the primary ways forward? Like what is going to happen like between now and 2100? And I realize, prediction is a mug's game, but what are the main outcomes that we need to minimize or to redirect? What's the problem if we don't do anything? What's the problem going to look like in 2100?
Yeah, and the way that I like to frame it is the best way to predict the future is to create that future. And we create the future by making decisions. We take one fork in the road versus another fork in the road. And if we look at the climate problem and the broader climate issue, there's really two parallel tracks that have developed over time. One is called mitigation, which is reducing the human effect on climate. The other is adaptation, which is reducing the climate's effect on humans. And there are a lot of reasons, and I wrote a book about this, why we might want to decarbonize the global economy beyond just global temperature change. One thing to realize is that there are still large numbers of people on this planet that don't enjoy the kind of energy access that you or I have.
Right.
And if we look, going forward, one thing that I think is a pretty safe bet, there's going to be more energy consumption worldwide going forward, as far as the eye can see, until people around the world reach the level of energy access that people in Europe or North America or South America have.
And this is a well-recognized paradigm. There's 2 points. There's one, just a lot of people are really not on the energy grid yet, but then also as energy gets more efficient, it isn't like, okay, we'll use less, we actually use more because it's cheaper and we can do more things with it.
Right. So for all those reasons, we're going to be using more energy, and energy production, as we know, can be dirty, can have environmental consequences. Setting aside climate change, particulate air pollution, from burning things like coal or even natural gas leads to millions of deaths around the world. So the idea of moving towards cleaner energy, it makes a lot of sense for a lot of reasons. And so the good news is that the energy system has been decarbonizing for almost a century. So what we're talking about with climate policy is accelerating a trend that's already in place on purpose. And we do this all the time. We want, I'll cite the same example, human lifespans. We want human lifespans to be longer because we like living, and we want disease to be reduced. And so we do that incrementally, disease by disease over time, and we see progress. Decarbonization is very similar, right? We make incremental progress. And I think the news is actually really good on the costs of solar and wind energy. There are, of course, debates over nuclear and whether people fear nuclear more than they fear climate change or vice versa. But the trend in mitigation is a positive one. Will countries reach net zero by 2050? I mean, it's a huge endeavor. But one thing we can say is it's front and center in our policy debates right now. So I think we have good reason to be optimistic.
What is, can I ask from a kind of doctrine or libertarian perspective, what are the prime, the motive forces in decarbonization? Is it a kind of market-driven, innovative search for more efficient and energy-producing forms of energy, or is it government policies where people on some level, representative bodies have said we want cleaner air, or we want less carbon, we want this, we want that? Is that what are the forces that have driven the decarbonization?
Yeah, I tell my PhD students to beware questions that have an or in the middle. The answer is always yes.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the energy economy, which is a significant part of the global economy, something, depending on how you measure it, like 10 or 20%, it is a complicated mix of market and government forces. And when I say government, the Saudi Arabian government is different than the United States government, is different than the Chinese government. So the energy economy is, the pacemaker is technological change and economics. So all things equal, people tend to prefer spending less money on energy than more money. And that provides a very powerful motivation for technological progress. Governments play a role both in, on the regulatory side, but also on the innovation side. If you look at your iPhone, there's nice graphs that show, a lot of the technologies came from, private and public sector intersection. It's the same with energy. Fracking is a great example. Folks at the Breakthrough Institute in particular have documented how, that was an overnight success story with 30 years of, government investment behind it, collaborating with the private sector. You can't really tease that apart. So I'm very much of the view that if we want to accelerate the rate of decarbonization, then we need to have market-ready, deployable energy technologies at scale that will lead to lower costs for consumers than the ones we have now. That's going to both support decarbonization, but also support the politics of decarbonization. Yeah, I was just gonna say, we see this right now. Joe Biden is wrestling with $4 a gallon gasoline, and it's a political issue. And for people who are wealthy, whether it's $3.50 or $4 doesn't matter, but for a lot of people, that's a significant difference and affects their life. So being able to produce lower cost sources of energy and then technologies that consume energy is how we're going to accelerate decarbonization.
So what are the best ways forward? Because I'm old enough, as I suspect you are, to remember the 70s, and there was a hell of a lot of money and time, taxpayer money spent on developing alternative fuels or synthetic fuels, et cetera, because people were tired of the good old odd even, gas pump days and things like that. What are the best policies for government to pursue to help kind of speed along the decarbonization, as opposed to kind of do political favoritism where shifting, if we shift to electric cars, but the electricity is all generated by burning coal, it kind of makes you, feel morally superior in your Prius or something like that, or in your Tesla, but you're not really fixing the problem. What are the best things that government can be doing to kind of speed up decarbonization?
Yeah, and ultimately this is a challenge of innovation, and I recommend let's look at innovation success stories for issues that are similar to the climate issue, long term, incremental, but we know where we want to go, and the two best examples are health and agriculture. The agricultural innovation system is just like I described, a complex brew of public-private sector. Yeah, is there political favoritism and cronyism and failures in agriculture? Of course, but undeniably, the world and the United States as well has continued to improve its productivity in agriculture. If you look at health, again, are there market failures? Are there public failures in health policy? Absolutely. But if you look at the long term, the improvement in human lifespans and the reduction of disease is undeniable. The fact that the United States, even before COVID, started to see a dip in lifespans, mainly because of opioids and substance abuse issues, was identified as a problem. But over the long term, we have good examples of how the public and private sectors can work together to accelerate progress towards a target.
So is that something like Operation Warp Speed? I guess in a generic way, maybe that's the wrong way to look at it, something where the government, issues a bounty or a reward for, if you develop something that passes this threshold, we'll pay you or we'll subsidize you.
Yeah, prizes and awards have been looked at as part of innovation policy, and they can be effective in a lot of respects. One thing for people to understand is that energy investment by the federal government has not typically been that large compared to, say, how much is spent on defense or health research. So one thing that could be done would be to expand, and we see calls for this with an ARPA-E and so on. But to expand the ecosystem of energy, not just R&D. R&D is important, but the whole innovation ecosystem to be able to bring things to market, to test things out, to see what works, see what doesn't work. We're really bad at picking technological winners because the future is hard to predict. So the more opportunities you have to create winners, the more winners you'll have. And of course, innovation policy is littered with failures, and that's going to go. So is drug research. It's littered with drugs that never make it to market, or potential drugs. So we should expect there's going to be failures, but we have a pretty good ability to accelerate innovation when we direct our attention towards that. So the climate debate, the focus is on temperatures and carbon dioxide emissions. And I've recommended, it's a little bit more technical, but I've focused on rates of decarbonization. So carbon dioxide per unit of GDP. We want our economy to get bigger, and we want carbon dioxide to go down. And so we can actually better manage to that sort of a target than, say, a very abstract temperature target. And that lends itself to evaluating the success or failure of alternative innovation policies.
Is there a role for nuclear energy? You talked about wind and solar. Hydroelectric power is also booming in certain parts of the world, and typically as a kind of state enterprise. Nuclear power, if you go back to the early 60s, I always find it fascinating that the foundational documents of both the Young Americans for Freedom, a right-wing student group in the early 60s, and Students for Democratic Society, a left-wing group founded in the early 60s, both take for granted in their foundational documents that we will have limitless, pollution-free, essentially cheap, if not absolutely free, energy provided by nuclear power plants. Obviously, that hasn't quite worked out. Countries like France still produce a majority of their electricity or energy through nuclear power. Other places in the U.S. were decommissioning stuff. Germany, getting rid of it. What is the role of nuclear power in, in a decarbonized global scenario?
Yeah, so I think one thing to understand in energy policy that different energy technologies are like teams, and people cheer for them or root against them, and they it's if we want to achieve deep decarbonization of the global economy, we need all the tools on the table, is my view. Um, every energy technology has risks, and I know people that are of my parents' generation, the environmentalists of the 60s and 70s, developed a very strong anti-nuclear views. Richard Nixon proposed that the United States would have 1,000 nuclear power plants, and we topped out at about 100. If we had 1,000, we'd be a lot closer to decarbonizing. There's nuclear technology is like any technology. It can advance, it can improve. There's plans for modular nuclear reactors and shipping containers that can power a small city and so on. So yes, I absolutely think that nuclear power has a role to play. If we look at Japan, Germany, Vermont, California, places that are shutting down or have shut down nuclear power plants, it gets replaced with fossil fuels, and that increases carbon dioxide emissions. It's perfectly legitimate for people to be afraid of this or that technology, but politically, people have to decide: am I more afraid of climate risks, or am I more afraid of nuclear power risks? Because guess what? They kind of trade off right now, because nuclear power is one of the technologies that delivers an enormous bang for the buck, bang for the land use, for addressing carbon dioxide.
And would you agree that the risks of nuclear energy have been overstated?
They're often overstated, absolutely. And if you look at what happened, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima, these were horrible disasters. But if you look at how many people invisibly die from particulate air pollution every year, the consequences of those disasters is minuscule compared to the consequences of burning coal and natural gas, for example.
What, how does China in particular, obviously China and India are the two, most populous countries on the planet, and China in particular is now, a geopolitical threat, or it's, and many people in the American kind of, political class are kind of pushing for a new Cold War with China. China is, is our counterpart, blah, blah, blah. Does the environmentalist movement or the decarbonization movement, is part of it kind of working through its fear and anxiety about China, trying to get, the developing world, or China in particular, to give up, its proven energy resources in things like coal and fossil fuels? Or, how much of, I guess, environmental concerns for the developing world and for China is actually geopolitics masquerading as kind of empathy?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I see often in environmental discussions, I don't know if it's the opposite, but the idea that, well, let's just be friends with China, because we're going to need to cooperate for, you see this in some of John Kerry's discussions, that, climate change is too important to allow geopolitics to get in the way. And I think that's a little bit fanciful, because geopolitics is always there. I think it's probably more healthy for the environmental community to embrace the realities of the global economy, in which the United States and its workers are going to be competing with workers in China, elsewhere in India, to produce the energy systems that are going to power all of Africa, Southeast Asia. I mean, the energy economy is going to continue to expand, and there are going to be winners and losers in that economic development. And whether it's China's Belt and Road program, or Joe Biden's Build Back Better, or whatever, we have to understand that that it is in our interest to develop the technologies, and forget about climate change. We want high-paying jobs. We want people who are making a lot of money in our economy. That's good for politics. Somebody's going to be building the grids, installing nuclear power plants, solar, wind in places around the world. And the argument I would make, if I'm a politician, is, let's make that Americans, not Chinese, not Indians, and so on. And then you have more of a virtuous cycle. Of course, the military geopolitical overlay on global power is always going to be there. And I don't think that's going to supplant or displace these economic forces, which also will always be there.
As a final question, what are the best ways rhetorically? Your vision of what's going on is a comforting one. It's non-alarmist, while being explicitly environmentalist in your concerns. What are the best ways to reach people who are very committed to the idea that, there is a kind of on-off switch that we're approaching, that like the internet meme, the finger is getting closer and closer to the red button where, the earth is just boiling in its own juices and it's all over. What is the best way to convince people that what we're actually talking about is a kind of gradient upon which temperature or climate is going to be changing, temperatures are going to be going up, but that this, it's not yes or no, it's not on or off, but rather it's dealing with, a kind of scenario where things gradually change and get better or worse, and that we adapt as well as kind of change how we're, actually impacting the universe or the environment.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fantastic question. I'm probably not the best person to answer it because I found that the people on the apocalypse side and the people on the hope side take up a lot of the oxygen in this issue. The reality is that that's not where policy is actually made. And so I tend to gravitate away from those extremes on both sides. And when you start talking to people about real policy and people who are involved in making real policy around the world, there is an enormous appetite for a more grounded, a more pragmatic approach to climate policy. So I'm actually very optimistic that we're well positioned, that we're making good progress. And if your view of the world is, the extreme right or the extreme left, or you spend all your time on social media, you could get a very different perspective than that. But I think that very much like the population debates of the 1970s, which were also very extreme, we didn't move past those debates because people on the extremes got convinced of anything. We moved past those debates because the evidence from the real world became undeniable that, we got this. Yeah, are there hungry people? Yeah, there sure are. There's still, 700 million hungry people around the world. But are we doing better and moving in the right direction? Yes. And so I think the population debate is a good model for how the climate debate might evolve. Is that it's not going to end with a bang. It's going to end with a whimper, and pretty soon we're going to see. It's true. Less people are dying from extreme weather. We're still producing food. Our energy system is changing. Is climate change a threat and has risks? Yes. Does population create pressures? Yes. But as we go forward, I think the evidence of the real world will help us to move on to fight about something else loudly that's not climate change.
Roger Pielke Jr., thanks for talking to Reason.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
I want you to panic. Around the year 2030, we will be in a position where we set off an irreversible chain reaction that will most likely lead to the end of our civilization as we know it.
If there's one consistent message coming from activists and politicians pushing the Green New Deal and massive new subsidies for renewable energy, it's that if we don't take radical action now, life on Earth as we know it will soon be irreversibly destroyed.
The world is going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change.
The claim is that time is running out.
And science tells us that how we act or fail to act in the next 12 years will determine the very livability of our planet.
This fear-mongering is flat out misleading, and the findings of the scientists studying global warming don't support such alarmist claims, according to the new book, Apocalypse Never.
Please welcome Michael Schellenberger. I know you're an environmentalist because you're not wearing a tie. Right. Okay? But you're a radical new kind of environmentalist because you're very well coiffed.
The book argues that deforestation and deaths from extreme weather are actually declining, and concerns about environmental damage from plastics are fundamentally misplaced. Schellenberger, who began his career as an advocate for more government spending on wind and solar, was eventually disillusioned after witnessing the failure of subsidies to fix the inherent drawbacks of renewables. Named a hero of the environment by Time magazine in 2008, Schellenberger is an expert reviewer for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He also appeared in the 2013 documentary Pandora's Promise, which was shown at Sundance and featured several prominent environmentalists who have come around to see the virtues of nuclear power.
It really took us getting clear about how big the gap was between fossil fuels and renewables for us to take a second look at nuclear.
Coal, natural gas, fracking, and nukes. You're my kind of liberal.
I interviewed Schellenberger over Zoom about his new book and why he believes that environmentalism has become a replacement for religion in an increasingly secular world. Michael Schellenberger, thanks for talking to Reason.
Thanks for having me.
So your book is Apocalypse Never, subtitled Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All. Give me the elevator pitch of the book.
I mean, the elevator pitch of the book is that everything they told us about the environment is wrong. Often it's the opposite of what they said. Climate change is real, but it's not the end of the world. It's not even our most important environmental problem. Poverty, underdevelopment, bad government are the biggest factors driving environmental degradation, the same factors behind poverty and disease and all the things we're familiar with. But more proximate problems that are much more serious, in my view, is the continued use of wood as fuel by 1 to 2 billion people in the world. The overeating of wild animals in general, certainly wild fish. The oceans are in much worse shape than many people realize. But just the kind of poverty that pushes people into forests to farm and use wood as fuel and eat wild animals are really underappreciated threats. And the solutions are industrialization and urbanization. The solutions are moving away from renewables towards fossil fuels and eventually towards nuclear, which is obviously the best form of energy. And that trajectory, the physical hierarchy of energy and the moral hierarchy are just perfectly overlapped. I don't know any other discipline or any other science that shows this so clearly, that one's life is deeply improved by moving from wood to fossil energy, and then one's life is further improved by becoming French and getting most of your electricity from nuclear.
That's that's a bold claim to say that we need to become French in order to improve the future or to have a future. But let's start. There's a lot of claims there, and I want to work through some of them. The book is, and I'll congratulate you up front. It is, it's both kind of a memoir, but it's also a policy book, and you do a really great job of blending them. Your personal story is really interesting because you are an environmentalist. Can you talk a bit about why you are interested in preserving or improving the environment, and how that stems out of earlier political commitments?
Yeah, so I'm going to give away the ending, but basically some of the punchline to the book is that our love of nature is irrational. There's no justification. And I criticize conservationists for somehow suggesting that the continued existence of yellow-eyed penguins or mountain gorillas are somehow important to human civilization, that if those species went extinct, that somehow it'd be like a Jenga puzzle and then the human civilization would crash down and suddenly we wouldn't have roads and electrical systems and sewage systems and whatever. And it's just ridiculous. There's no mechanism for any of it. And that the reason that we want to save these species is the same. One might say it's the same reason that we preserve Van Gogh paintings, or it's the same reason that we, protect old churches or something. So it's
a preference. It's a preference that we have. Is it enough to say that?
Of course, you can say that. You can say it's aesthetic. You can say it's spiritual. All those are fine to me. As an environmental activist, when we were saving redwood trees, we never had to. Our strategy to save redwood trees was like here's a photo of ancient redwoods. Don't you want to save them? It wasn't we must save these redwoods because if we don't, then the apocalypse will come and And so you kind of go, well, how do we get to the end is near? And so that traces back through the birth of what we call environmentalism, which is really the marriage of Malthusianism and socialism.
Well, can I ask to dilate a little bit on this, the kind of preference question? Early conservationists, I guess more than environmentalists or even preservationists, would often talk about going into the woods. And of course, this happens after kind of industrialization has taken place. But you go to the woods to commune with nature, and that's a powerful feeling and a meaning. That's kind of where you're talking about the preference for keeping nature going is there. How does that then get yoked to Malthusianism and a kind of an apocalyptic alarmism about the end of, the last mountaintop or the last tree, something like that?
Right. Well, so there's sort of two reversals that occur. I mean, the first reversal is that the woods go from being a place of danger and criminality that have to be conquered for God's plan, in Europe, the United States, to something that is beautiful and sacred and special. So that occurs, at least in Europe in what's called the early modern period between the 16th and 18th centuries. And of course, it occurs after we start living in cities.
Right.
So you only appreciate the thing after you're not victim of it.
The American Indian was never so beloved as when he was no longer a threat, right, to frontier people. Yeah.
You got it. Exactly. So that's the first reversal. And then we get this period of sort of conservation called aesthetic or spiritual, doesn't matter, which lasts until about World War II. And so after World War II, there is a very powerful Malthusian drive, I would say, by elites in the West, particularly in the Anglo-American countries, but it spreads throughout Europe. And it attaches itself to a bunch of conservation concerns. And it does that in a bunch of different ways. But for the most part, conservationists in America, in the United States, and really probably in Europe as well, though we looked mostly at, I spent most time in California, was the conservationists were pro-nuclear, pro-economic growth, pro-people, pro-cities. They even said things like, you have to have a lot of cheap energy to just protect nature, to just have nature. Nature takes a lot of work. You have to have the boundaries. I talk about in Congo, you talk to people and be like, how is your life? Just interview them. What's going on around here? And they're like, hey, what do you, and they always know because you're a big, tall white guy. They know why you're there. You're there to be at the park. And they go, can you ask the park director to put electric wire around the park? Because the wild animals keep eating my crops. Right. So that reality, of course, still exists in really poor countries. But managing nature turns out to be very expensive. And of course, there's opportunity cost loss. But that was the earlier view.
It's an amazing thing, if I can just interject. I know in the early 60s when Students for a Democratic Society in their founding document, the Port Huron Statement, and the Young Americans for Freedom, their conservative counterpart that was founded by William F. Buckley and a couple of other conservatives, each of their manifestos, they assume nuclear power and essentially free, unlimited, non-polluting energy. And that was, in the early 60s, that's what we were looking forward to. Obviously, it didn't work out that way.
Yeah, I mean, the Port Huron Statement is so interesting because, of course, it's like small modular nuclear reactors powering suburbs.
Yeah.
Because people had escaped at that point, they still thought the cities were these monster cities. I think that was the language they used, right? Monster cities. And then we're all going to live in suburbs powered by nuclear. Well, today it's the exact opposite. Now environmentalists want to have cities but powered by renewables. And I show why that's physically not going to work for inherent power density reasons. But nonetheless, you get to these humanistic, greatest generation conservatiors who are overthrown in the Sierra Club, elsewhere too, but we focus on the Sierra Club because that's such a pivotal organization. And they're overthrown by the Malthusians who are anti-nuclear, whereas the earlier conservationists are pro-nuclear. And so it took me a long time. It took me many years to get to the bottom of what that was about.
Is it partly that nuclear, talk a little bit about how nuclear went from being the savior of kind of the jet age or whatever to being, the ultimate thing that we had to avoid. Was it And I mean, you talk about it at length in the book, but is it a kind of transference from nuclear power to nuclear weapons? And nuclear weapons, obviously, Hiroshima and Nagasaki are the things to be avoided. Where, in the post World War II era and through the 60s, we're living, 15 minutes from the end of humanity and all of that kind of stuff. Is that what made nuclear energy such a pariah? Because I know people like Stuart Brand, the Whole Earth Catalog founder, Mary Prankster, important figure in the development of personal computing as a concept and a technology, was always pro-nuclear, but that went missing in the counterculture years, right?
Well, just on the case of Stuart, he changed his mind around 2009, and that was why I changed my mind. So he only changed his mind very late.
Okay.
But, yeah, I mean, I think the short version is that I see two big factors animating anti-nuclear ideology, really starting more strongly in the 60s. And it was first just the truly shocking nature of the bomb, and the truly terrifying nature of the bomb is real. And I think some people feared it and hated it for some ideological reasons, but there is some independent, just the bomb is a very serious invention. The second is the Malthusianism, which is that the problem that nuclear energy poses to Malthusians who want to control society and restrict growth and do all the things that we know what the people that call themselves environmentalists want to do. It's threatened by nuclear energy, because nuclear energy means you have infinite energy, infinite fresh water, infinite fertilizer, and that means you have infinite food. So nuclear eliminates resource scarcity. Now, how much resource scarcity really was there before nuclear? I mean, it wasn't like we were ever really running out of energy. We now know we weren't running out of oil or gas or coal or any of that. So that wasn't really real necessarily. But nonetheless, I think I document basically a reaction to nuclear by Malthusians that I think is clearly motivated by a fear that basically this human cancer, in their view, the human virus, we have to cut off its power source. That was always the idea. And again, I think it's more irrational than rational. Sometimes these guys don't really pull it apart. And you're right about the transference, or I don't know if transference is, I probably shouldn't use that word because it has so much psychoanalytical meaning, but displacement, I think, is the word we use in the book, which is that the fear displaces from the bomb onto the power plants. And that's true, although it's worth noting that it's not something universally true. It's true among people who are on the left, not just the radical left either, but really this is often just mainstream liberals. And I think this comes from the kind of old Kantian view. I didn't get into it in the book necessarily, but this desire that human reason be the thing that ends war, not a technical fix, which is ultimately what nuclear is.
It gets confusing very quickly because, you mentioned France. France supplies a large percentage of a vast majority of its electricity needs via nuclear power plants. And in Europe, nuclear power seems more, is more acceptable. Nuclear weapons, definitely not. In the United States, nuclear power is pretty verboten. Is it, is there a consistent thread, or is that it's Malthusianism and a dislike of a post-scarcity world, and it just takes different forms depending on the social or political context?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that countries that have the bomb are more comfortable with nuclear. And in fact, I think it's not in the book because I didn't quite have the argument, but I've been looking at whether or not it could be that Japan and Germany are uniquely anti-nuclear because they weren't allowed to have it and they would like to level the playing field. Plus, I think there's some pride. I mean, look, it's the best weapon. Obviously, it's the best weapon. And Japan and Germany, as anybody that's spent any time there knows, these are these are people that are deeply committed to excellence and have deep pride in doing the best of everything, and here they are denied the best weapon.
Before we get to the apocalyptic turn, because that's really what what your book, in its title, it's Apocalypse Never. You're confronting that. That's certainly the contemporary political discourse. Talk a little bit about how you individually grew to be an environmentalist, and why it matters to you.
I mean, yeah. So for me, just probably boring like everybody. My parents took me camping a lot. So I loved being out. I loved nature, and they were sort of, I think my mom was still Christian. My dad was more post-Christian, but out of the Mennonite tradition, which is a pacifist, anti-statist, libertarian tradition, by the way.
Right. Yeah, very much so. I'm happy to see you wearing buttons. You've gotten past that, right?
There's progress.
Yeah.
So I mean, in some ways I always felt like I had a very basic morality. I was never Malthusian. I just was never, people would say there's too many people in the world, and it always struck me as racist. I knew they would be like, no. And of course there's too many, rich white people too. And you'd always be kind of like, yeah, but it seems like all the sterilization camps are in India. It's like, doesn't seem like this is evenly distributed concern. But I had a more apocalyptic view, and I trace that in some ways to just the bomb. I mean, I'm a Gen Xer. I don't know. I was born in 1971, so by 1980, the movie The Day After, I think, is 1983. So I was like 12, and this movie, the ABC encourages parents to watch this movie with their children, right. And it just like whatever, 15 minutes in, it's just. I mean, and they showed classrooms of children being carbonized,
right?
So
school's out.
Yeah, exactly. So that was definitely there. And my certainly my dad was more left wing than my mom. I read Chomsky at like 17 and went to Nicaragua at 17 to work, help the Sandinistas. And so I think the apocalypticism also comes from socialism or Marxism a bit too, which is a kind of view that, of course, there will be the coming of the kingdom of heaven, except for it'll be communism or socialism in the transition phase. So I had all of that. I think there was a bunch of things. I mean, in the book, I talk about just living with small farmers and trying to be a revolutionary socialist with small farmers. You discover small farmers are like, they're not on board necessarily with collectivization. They've got their own farm. They don't really even want their brother telling them how to do it. That was a big deal. Seeing kind of the difference between first world problems and third world problems, which most people never experience in poor countries, had a big impact. And it just became clear that like a lot of environmentalists were just putting nature ahead of lifting people out of poverty, and that was unethical. And in fact, the humans had to always come first, because otherwise, bad things happen and bad things are justified. And so I think and then I think another big moment was just changing my mind about nuclear. And once you change your mind about nuclear, you kind of go, there's an aha moment that goes, oh, so we don't have to spread all these crappy renewables all over our deserts and forests. We don't have to grind up all this nature for climate change. You can just have nuclear power plants. And once you understand how power density works, and that it's good to move up the energy ladder from wood and dung to coal to oil to natural gas to uranium, and that intensified agriculture produces more food on less land, there's kind of a picture that you get. And it was that picture that I had, and it just took a while to be able to actually turn it into the book.
Let's talk about contemporary alarmism. In October, and these are quotes that are in the book, Apocalypse Never. October 2018, Greta Thunberg, or rather in 2019, in October of 2018, a UN IPCC report comes out, which was widely kind of misinterpreted to say we have 12 years left. Greta Thunberg in 2019 says, I want you to panic about the imminent end of the world. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who was pushing the Green New Deal along with Senator Martin O'Malley, a Democrat from Massachusetts or Maryland, but she says the world is going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change. They're wrong. How can you, according to you, they're wrong? What is the brief argument of how wrong they are?
So the two most important things anybody needs to know about climate change are that deaths from natural disasters have declined 90% over the last 100 years. They've declined 80% over the last 40 years, including in very poor countries. We should be celebrating this like every day of the week. Tiny amounts of people are swept away in floods and hurricanes and cyclones and killed. It's just great news. And then the other thing is that carbon emissions have peaked in rich countries. They're going to peak in poor countries in the next 10, 20 years, maybe most. Some people think they peaked already. I don't. And so we're probably most likely going to be coming around 3 degrees increase in temperatures globally over pre-industrial levels. Any increase in temperature does create changes to how we've created our society and what the habitats that we've set aside for animals are. So any increase in temperatures does create problems. There are benefits too, but it definitely creates more problems. So you don't want to have high temperatures if you can avoid them, all else being equal. But, the guy that won the Nobel Prize for Economics on climate change, the Yale University professor William Nordhaus, said the optimal level for balancing costs and benefits was 4 degrees. So now we're going to hit 3 degrees. It's not the end of the world. Again, closer
literally,
to 2,
literally and figuratively, not the end of the world.
There is, yeah. And so I opened that first. I'm going to publish it. I'm just going to give away the first chapter. I think I persuaded my publisher to just give away the first chapter, and I go through that evidence that you describe, and then I say, does any of that sound like the end of the world? Let's go to the end of the world and see what life is actually like there. And if you go to the Congo, the difference between the Congo and my home in Berkeley is that we have, like, when the rain floods down my hillside here, we have a flood control system that makes sure my house is not washed away. They don't have that in the Congo. They don't have electrical grid that functions properly. I do. There's nothing in any climate scenario that's going to basically wipe out our roads and electrical systems and sewage systems or flood control systems. And yet that's the way that climate change is described in these apocalyptic scenarios, which you can't find in anything in the IPCC. IPCC doesn't even suggest I think I've been looking at this question of, could you ever say that you think anybody will die? I think I can safely say nobody should die from climate change. I don't see a scenario where that death toll that's declined from disasters will go up. Now, let me make a point on this because I think it's important. I'm going to write something about this. People who say climate change is making disasters worse are either deliberately misleading you, completely ignorant, or they are using a definition of disasters that the IPCC and scientists don't use. A hurricane on its own is not a disaster. What a disaster is, according to IPCC, is the effect of the hurricane on deaths and costs, people and whatever. It's the interaction between the weather event and the thing. So I've been trying to get the scientist to tell me how she's claiming that climate change is making disasters worse. How would you be able to claim that if the deaths from disasters are going down? You'd have to sort of imagine that they would have gone down more if you had less temperature increase.
Deaths are going down, even though we have developed, and everybody around the globe have developed much more along coastlines, along places that are more likely to have extreme weather events.
Yeah, and they experienced like a 90 or even higher % decline in deaths from cyclones in the Indian Basin just by having better weather because of they're better able to predict weather. And then they have storm shelters, but super low cost. Like really, it wasn't. So on the one hand, you kind of go, well, we're more wealthy, so we're more protected from natural disasters, which is true. But some of it's just cheap stuff. But I mean, I'm kind of like, I can't figure out if you kind of go, hurricanes are getting a little bit more severe. The fire season's a bit longer. It's just outweighed by other factors, So in the fires, I point out that it's the buildup of wood fuel in forests, and it's building houses near forests that explain all of the increase in fire frequency and severity. In the case of floods, it's whether you have a flood control system or not. I mean, the New York Times has been running these news stories like hyping flood threat, and you're kind of like, well, so then we'll make our flood systems better. I mean, it's not like somehow we're all going to be flooded because of climate change. They make it sound almost biblical in the threat it poses, as opposed to fairly modest changes that we're very easily, especially in rich countries, able to adapt to.
And so, I mean, is the equation for you as simple or as direct rather as if you care about people? The good news is that fewer people are dying from weather, fewer people are dying from pollution or environmental degradation as we're getting better at that. And the way to kind of supercharge all of that is to increase general wealth.
I mean, obviously, yeah. I mean, there's so many reasons to increase wealth. So obviously that should be a major goal. Economic growth should be it is, and it already is, of course, at the highest priority. But you basically see what you get with the Malthusian left is they say we have to do this, all this. I mean, the Democrats just put out another terrible, just a mash of bad spending on climate stuff that doesn't, first of all, most of it doesn't actually reduce emissions, doesn't have anything to do with carbon emissions. Jobs programs and all this stuff. I mean, some of it might be fine. I mean, I might be fine with some of it. I'm not even saying it's all bad. I'm just saying it's not about climate change. And a lot of the emphasis in terms of renewables, I point out, is that precisely because renewables make energy expensive. That was not a bug. That was a feature of renewables as it's always been imagined in every Green New Deal.
So, and the idea there is if it's more expensive, you use less of it.
Yeah, it's a very crude model of basically making energy more scarce and slowing down this virus of growth. It's just a degrowth, anti-growth agenda masquerading itself in green clothing in a variety of ways. That's why I think the watermelon that gets said sometimes, I think on the libertarian front, where people see greens as just watermelons.
Right.
I don't think it's quite
so
the
that means
same.
green on the outside and red communist on the
certainly
inside.
Marx, there's an anti-growth quality here that wasn't either so explicit or it wasn't really central to what Marxism and socialism were supposedly about.
Yeah. Quite. Marxism was also trying to get to a post-scarcity world, and it's fascinating that kind of the modern environmental movement is really about intensifying scarcity.
Right. So it's about, I basically, the book is it's in three, I don't have it broken into three parts in the book, but basically the first third is everything you've been told about the environment is wrong. It's just a debunking of climate, deforestation, plastic straws, species extinctions. The second third is how do humans actually save the natural environment? Like in the real world, how did we save the whales? That's urbanization, industrialization, substitution. We save sea turtles by not making glasses out of their shells anymore. We use plastics. And then the last third is like how, if environmental problems are manageable, if many of the trends are going in the right direction, if there's really there's no like scientific basis for imagining some catastrophic events from climate change, what's going on? What is this about? And so I basically just summarize it as money, power, and religion. And while I think money and power are really important, obviously I wrote whole chapters on them. I think there are independent factors behind this. I think this is at bottom. This is people constructing an alternative religion.
So this is because of the general secularization of the world. We still have a religious impulse, and it's being rooted in a kind of transcendental, symbolic love of nature.
Yeah, and the problem with it is that it doesn't acknowledge it. In other words, if I'm a Jew and you're a Christian or a Muslim or whatever, and we're like, I'm a Jew, I'm a Christian, I'm a Muslim, that's who I am. But it's my religion, and then I have science. I mean, most religious people, very few reject science. Most people are like, I got my religion, and then I've got my science. And then there's kind of a science, and there's sort of two different. When I go to church, I'm at church. When I'm reading IPCC reports, it's something else. Environmentalists, they're because they don't think that they're in the grip of a religion. They start treating nature as a new god. They start treating science as a new religion. And that's when things just go absolutely bonkers and problematic.
Let me ask you to work through kind of how do you convert is the wrong word, but how do you engage somebody constructively if they are kind of thinking religiously without acknowledging it? And to go back to renewables, it's interesting to hear you talk about how part of the whole point of renewables was to increase the cost of energy so that even if it wasn't destroying, even if we weren't sucking oil out of the earth and ruining things that way, we have renewable energy, but it's going to be more expensive. So even though it doesn't despoil the environment, we use less of it. Can you quickly kind of sketch, is the problem with renewables now that they are too expensive compared to other alternatives, or is it that they don't work at scale, or is it a combination of both of those?
So think of it this way, that there's basically, renewables are for, pre-industrial subsistence farming societies. They're low energy density. It's wood, sunlight, water, wind. They're all very low energy density fuels or flows. Fossil fuels are much bigger increases in energy density. They're what allow us to have cities. You can't have renewable powered cities. We did try. We had horse-drawn carriages, and you had horse feces everywhere and disease and all sorts of problems. So with electricity, then also you can have elevators and the buildings can go higher until you get to nuclear, where really you completely dematerialized your power source. So the problem with renewables is it's just physics. This Michael Moore movie, which got all this controversy, which documents the big environmental problems of renewables. They document the big environmental problems with renewables, but then they kind of suggest that it's because of capitalism, as though like a solar farm wouldn't require 400 times more land in a socialist society. Solar farm requires 400 times more land than a natural gas plant or a nuclear plant because of the physics of sunlight or wind. I mean, there's just nothing. People go, well, the solar panels have become 2% or 10% more efficient. Okay, so then it'll be just 360 times more land. There's no, and that's, by the way, it's actually been 2% efficiency improvement over 10 years, not 10. So you're talking about, and then there's just the unreliability of it. You have to have reliable power for it to be cheap power. Every time you're moving electricity out of the grid into a battery or something else and then back in, you're getting two energy conversions. So renewables, they're doing a lot of work for people. Renewables are doing the work for Malthusians of trying of at least a fantasy of moving to a low energy society. They're obviously a place that crony capitalists can make a lot of money just subsidy farming. And then they're providing the spiritual fantasy of harmonizing human societies with nature, which is the whole point. So renewables, renewables and organics and humans are now making themselves right by nature in the same way that Christians wanted to make themselves right by God. And so it's a new morality. Anybody that opposes renewables is immoral, right? And satanic in some sense. And nuclear itself is kind of satanic. It plays a satanic role in this new cosmology, which is so powerful because it's so unconscious. So part of the reason I wanted to write Apocalypse Never was let's just make it conscious and just kind of go, if you want to justify your religion, fine. But then I think you need to explain to everybody why it's worth the devastating impact it has on the natural environment, why it's worth the big cost increases, the increases that it forces in the electricity system. Because often what renewables are doing is they're externalizing their cost, the managing the radical unreliability of wind turbines. Suddenly it's like 5 a.m. or 4 a.m. and all this energy is on the grid. You have to pay people to take it. Like, it's just not, like, this is not great energy. It's often producing large amounts of garbage energy. So, you kind of go at the bottom, you kind of go, how, what could possibly allow such terrible energy to be viewed as something so good?
Right.
Only a religion could perform that.
Right. Do you find and obviously you have, throughout your career, you engage mostly, environmentalists and people like that. Are people receptive, are hardcore Greens receptive to being told you are in the throes of a religion that you can't even see because you're so deep into it?
Well, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I guess the question is, because we live in a world where, we have the Democratic Party, basically every one of their presidential candidates had signed on to some version of the Green New Deal, or at least paid lip service to it. And environmental, I mean, in a profound way, I think we are all environmentalists now, in the sense that we think about the costs and benefits of choices, of energy choices. And I'm old enough to remember the public service ads to to teach people not to just throw garbage out the window of a car on a highway. I mean, we all think in environmental terms, if in terms of cost benefit to the surrounding areas. But it looks like we're about to make a great leap forward into a very extreme version of it. So how do you, what is the target audience, I guess, in a way, for your book? Is it to get hardcore Greens to, kind of change the way they're thinking? Is it to get, there's a sizable group of people, including in the Republican Party, who are like, nothing is wrong that can't be fixed by just, dumping crude oil everywhere. How do you convert people to what your position is, which strikes me as like eminently sensible?
So, I wrote this book for so many different audiences. I definitely had conservatives on my mind while I was writing it. I definitely had progressives on my mind for writing it. They should be getting different things out of it if it's working. So for conservatives, I think the most important thing to do is to just get grounded, truly do get grounded in the science. There's still a lot of guys out there on the right who think that either the planet's not really warming, right, or that carbon dioxide is not a molecule.
Our esteemed president calls it, that climate change is a hoax, right? It's perpetrated by the Chinese government somehow. I don't even want to try and diagram that, that flow chart. But
I think it's a kind of a troll, honestly. I don't really know that anybody that says that actually believes it. There's definitely some sunspots people. But I testified in front of the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, and in January, and like not a single Republican was a climate denier, and they were all asking questions and they had other concerns, but it wasn't this kind of the old caricature, and certainly Trump obviously is responsible for some of that. So, but the old caricature I don't find is true among like most Republicans. I think that I think most Republicans didn't know. I talk a little bit about how, as the environment movement became Malthusian, the right actually became anti-Malthusian, even though Malthus is truly a conservative in just the kind of true conservative sense, and why that was. And so I think that and it's sort of the same reason libertarians ended up on the right, I think, in the United States. So I think that there's so I think there's sort of like just kind of reject all that. Because look, the IPCC science is like fine. IPCC policy recommendations are stupid and just reflect the green agenda, and we should criticize them. I'm actually a reviewer. I criticized them recently, but I think if the conservatives were to actually get a more scientific view on climate change and to adopt this more humanistic view that I'm proposing, which says, look, it's not like you're ever satisfied with your energy source, just like you're never satisfied with your food production. You always want to improve it. But the key is to be going in the direction of higher power densities, not in the direction of lower power densities, because that requires more nature, more material, more matter, more natural environment must be ground up to produce either electricity or food or products or whatever. And Republicans, I think, have been they've been sort of articulating something close, but it's been around the economy. And therefore, they've ended up reinforcing the sense that there's some necessary trade-off between the economy and the environment. But the truth is, like France, 75% nuclear, it's not poor because it has 75% nuclear. I think you could actually argue that it's rich. Right. So I think that there's been a confusion on this. I wanted to write this book for conservatives and Republicans and libertarians.
Okay, so then...
and then for progressives, obviously, they just... Yeah.
Well, talk a bit of...
just on progressives, it's just getting similarly. It's getting to the energy power... Yeah, it's just the progressives, it's just going also similarly getting your head screwed on right with the science and being like, renewables are problems because of low power densities. And this is just nothing to do with capitalism or the man or whatever. Right. Like, that's just a problem with your fuels. And that actually,
do you have a sense, it seems, you mentioned you're a Gen Xer, I'm a late baby boomer, and your argument makes perfect sense to me, and I suspect to a lot of Gen Xers. For millennials, Gen Z, younger Americans, the environment regularly shows up in kind of polls and surveys as a very high order principle and kind of moving towards a fully renewable, post carbon kind of energy future. Why do you think that is? And how do you reach younger people of whatever kind of ideological orientation?
I mean, look, it's a religion. I mean, it's just we're in a total religious revival. It's supposedly secular, but I think I look at, I don't work on race, but I listen to John McWhorter, and, John McWhorter was doing one of his things with Glenn Loury. And I think I saw you interview Glenn Loury, and I think McWhorter goes, I want to write a book on how anti-racism is the new religion. And I was like, I just did that on the environment. And it's like, I haven't spent any time trying to figure out how they kind of work together, but it's like the same people that are in the street around anti-racism were in the street around climate apocalypse. So, I mean, I think, the death of God, secularization. So first of all, people need something to believe in. That includes like some view of their own immortality, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. That's actually, I think it's part of being human. The argument I make is that actually our awareness of our mortality creates anxiety that then, I'm taking this from a major anthropologist who wrote on this, makes us want to have some kind of legacy. That's natural. That's okay. Makes us want to feel heroic. That's great. Be aware of it. Don't, pretend like you don't need that or want that. And then I think you need a new morality. This whole thing of the obsession with plastic straws, the I'm vegetarian. I showed these things are of no importance.
Can I ask you, I try to eat vegan, and I do that mostly for calories, not for ethical reasons, but you have a stat in the book which put me back on my heels. It's that if everybody adopted a vegetarian diet, how much of the earth would that save from farming?
It's basically from the
I'm sorry. What is the metric?
Carbon emissions, you mean? Yeah, I was gonna say. I mean, carbon emissions. It's 2 to 4%.
Right.
So it's basically not nothing. It's just nothing. You should not. And not only that, but like, I can explain why. Basically, like, it doesn't even work out that if you became vegetarian, you could sort of be like, there's more wilderness because there's less pasture. The big thing and how much land we use for meat is just whether are you spreading your cows all over the hillsides like Michael Pollan and the organicists want us to do, or are you confining them in the evil industrial farming way? Because the evil industrial farming way leaves more of the earth to the natural environment, obviously, right? Like, I don't need to provide any math. I mean, just think about it. You concentrate 100 cows over 100 miles of land versus 1 mile. Right. I mean, not that amount.
One of the things that I really appreciate about the book too is that you're not just picking off certain things for your argument. I mean, you talk about how there is a massive reforestation of the planet, which is a good thing. We have more plants, more trees, less land is being used for food production and energy production and things like that. But then that there are also problems with kind of forests that are planted by, people who are creating timber forests, right?
I mean, yeah, everybody knows that an old growth forest is just, if you've ever been in an old growth forest, it's like for me, it's one of my peak spiritual, existential peak experiences. Old growth redwood forests or old growth oak forests, they feel different. They feel like you're in a cathedral. If you're in some tree farm, so I point out, there's reforestation, but it's not exactly necessary. It's not there's real loss in the Amazon. The bigger dynamic is that by promoting bad forms of agriculture, Greenpeace has encouraged fragmentation of the primary old growth forest, which we need if you're going to have like big cat species that can move around hundreds of kilometers of space. You need these big apex predators. And so they fragmented it because they actually thought that there was something wrong with concentrated, industrialized, intensified agriculture, when that's the key. That's the most important thing when it comes to saving the natural environment, what we call the natural environment conservation. It's concentrating animal production, concentrating food production, intensifying food production, more food on less land. It's just obvious. It's physics. There's no advanced physics. It's just simple when you think about it. And yet the dogmatism and the religiosity then has resulted in real ecological harm, not just harm to people.
Could you, I want to get to, I want to hear you make the best case possible for nuclear power, ubiquitous nuclear power in a second, but just as a specific point, you had mentioned this in passing about how the next or the sixth extinction is not going to happen. It's not happening. This is something that we hear a lot. It's like plastic straws, killing all sorts of sea life. These are the kind of talking points or aphorisms of the environmentalist movement. What is going on with extinctions, and why should we not be overly concerned right now that we're going to wake up? By the fall, most of our species are going to be extinct.
Let me tell you what we should first be concerned about, and I'll tell you what you shouldn't be concerned about. We should just be concerned that humans have a large footprint. We take up a lot of the earth. There's just not as much habitat for endangered species as we would want. Poverty in particular often drives people into forested or grassland areas, converts them into farming or ranching, and that is how you get loss of habitat. It's also how you get wild animal consumption. So that's what you want to worry about. Extinction, because it's such a powerful word, is used by scientists to advance public relations and advocacy for their conservation agenda. The problem is that we're not in the sixth mass extinction. We would be, you'd have to be the amount, the share of extinctions has to be just enormous. We're just at a very tiny, and it's, and the other thing that actually people don't realize is that what happened was the way they construct this is they create these models where they assume a certain amount of loss of habitat would lead to a certain number of extinctions. Well, they were wrong. The models always overestimated extinctions. Just turns out species are actually, many animal and plant and other species are just good at occupying less and less land. It's kind of sad, actually. It's kind of amazing as well, but it's not like extinction is like, in other words, we're really good at maintaining a lot of species diversity, even if you just don't have, enough. I think for me, half of all wild animals, we have half the number of wild animals in the world today that we had in 1960. That's the issue. If you just care about wild animals and you want more wild animals, that's too bad. We should have been eating cows and pigs and chickens instead of eating all those animals and taking their habitat. So that's why the extinction. And then the other problem with the extinction stuff is that it's just very apocalyptic. Like if you I quote this conservation scientist who goes, if you believe all that sixth extinction stuff, then why would you bother? Why would you bother saving things? It's just wrong and stupid. One of the things I did in this book very deliberately, very carefully, is I got the key scientists on the phone that often make these apocalyptic claims. I interviewed them like a proper reporter would, which amazingly no environmental reporters had done before me, and basically got them on the record admitting that, either they were bullshitting basically or grossly exaggerating, or in the case of the species extinctions one, I just got some of the main scientists to just go on the record and just be like, no, you're right. We're not in the midst of a sixth extinction. Okay, then why did you guys tell everybody that for like the last 10 goddamn years,
Well, how, from a lay position, and we live in both simultaneously, and I guess these things are related, an age of experts and an absolute loss of faith in experts, confidence in experts and institutions. Yeah. What are the tells that you're being sold a line of BS on environmental claims? You spend a fair amount of time in the book, and it makes for good reading, but it's infuriating looking at the tactics and the claims of the group Extinction Rebellion, which is primarily or very big in England. But how do you know when people are kind of stretching for true claims?
Well, this book, I think that I look at things like healthcare, as like complicated. I look at energy and the environment as not that complicated. In some ways you just go, those things I mentioned, declining death tolls, from natural disasters. Someone starts talking about people dying, any number, millions or billions. You have to be like, what is the mechanism for that? What is the mechanism? Like, how will those people die? Oh, well, we might run out of food. Well, actually, it turns out everybody agrees that as long as the poor countries using fertilizer, irrigation, tractors, and have roads, we're going to produce much more food than we produce today. We produce 25% more food than we need. Obesity is a problem. We throw away huge amounts of food. That's great. In some ways it's great. It's terrible, the waste, but it is kind of a sign that we're secure and wealthy and that's not the issue. So, and then in terms of like, this story about energy moving from lower energy densities, both on energy and food production, as well as cities, by the way. Power densities increase, like down in like Manhattan is like insanely high power density. Singapore, right? High power densities. These little rural parts of Congo is super low. So just understanding that, and that energy substitutes for matter, that you can leave the natural environment by using more energy to protect it, to save it. I think these things, once people get that framework, this is like the last, I'm not going to do another book on the environment. I've already decided. Like, I've just got other things I want to do. I write other articles, but like this book actually, secretly I've hidden an environmental studies textbook in this book. It has all of the science. It has the basic framework that you should get in your environmental studies textbook and are not getting. So I do feel like once you read this book, your brain will be able to detect the bullshit.
Okay. Well, let's try it out and see if I can detect bullshit from you when you talk about nuclear power. And, we talked a bit about how, the nuclear age is born in, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the mushroom cloud. That's terrifying. And then, we still have, God knows where, more than enough nuclear weapons to blow up the planet 1 million times over and all of that. We have nuclear power in parts of the world. France overwhelmingly, generates its electricity by that. Places like Japan, places like Russia. But, then the history of nuclear power seems to be littered with these warning signs, these blips, or more than blips. Fukushima, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, which not in the same league, I guess. But why should we be moving towards nuclear? And also, then, is it actually affordable in any kind of meaningful way?
I mean, I think the first thing you have to understand about nuclear, you have to appreciate what it is. It is a revolutionary moment in human evolution. It's a completely radical new technology. Okay. It is, and we knew it would be, like, literally before it was invented in the early 1900s, before they had even split the atom. There was books describing how once we got nuclear energy, it would both open up the possibility of super bombs, huge bombs, and limitless energy, basically. Limitless clean energy. They didn't quite use that word, but that was where they were talking about. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you get it at the lab level. The Manhattan Project required this huge, only the US government could have done it with massive wartime mobilization. But splitting the atom happens in the lab. I mean, that's just, and they literally, as soon as the word gets out that they did it, everybody replicates it in their lab around the world. So this is not something where you can just kind of be like smallpox, where you can be like, well, okay, we'll have some smallpox in a couple of freezers in the United States and Russia. Like this comes right out of human knowledge. So what that means is, so first of all, I mean, one of the things so interesting I discovered in the research for Apocalypse Never was, like, really right after the bomb, this group of scholars at Yale and some guys from Harvard too, they figured out right away what it would mean. In fact, Niels Bohr, the Nobel Prize winning Danish physicist who visits Manhattan Project, sees Oppenheimer, goes up to him and is like, this is going to change everything. This is going to end war. I mean, like, literally, they were like, it's going to end war. And then it freaked them out because of what it meant for it to end war. And so there was some backpedaling on how do we control it and whatever. But basically, long story short, like, it was clear that this weapon is truly terrifying. And in fact, that's how it works. If it wasn't so terrifying, it wouldn't be creating peace between India, China, India, Pakistan,
right?
And other countries.
The Soviets and the West, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the Chinese and whatever. So it's that. But that is so kind of horrible in the sense that was what, like, I remember talking to a friend of mine who's progressive, very much a UN type, and I was like, well, it just sounds like it just upsets you that this is what it took to kind of tame the human beast. She was like, yeah, it's horrible. Like, it was supposed to happen through brotherly love and reason. This was console, that whole idea.
So I think that was, that's the weaponry. Then how do we, make the case for it as the best power source for the future?
So then you get to the energy, and it was obvious to everybody that it was going to be the best form of energy. Like, just because of all the reasons we know now, the high power densities, the fact that there's no air and water pollution, the fact that the so-called waste is just these used fuel rods that can be stored on site. tiny quantities of which never hurt anybody, never will hurt anybody. That was all that, and there was almost a manic enthusiasm for nuclear energy in the 50s, in part, I think, as a kind of like way to make this terrifying new reality more palatable. But that then didn't last very long. And then the Malthusians start going after nuclear. The Quakers and Mennonites and pacifists and others start going after nuclear weapons. And then it eventually just displaces itself onto nuclear energy, both deliberately and through concerted political action. And then, so your question, and this is all my way of getting to your question, the accidents, whatever. First of all, it'd be like saying, like when you kind of go, well, I don't know, chemistry, look at all the accidents with chemistry. I mean, it's kind of like if there's a whole new field of science, which is what nuclear, a whole new field of science, a whole new industrial capacity. Like you kind of go, well, of course there's going to be a shitload of accidents. Like you're kind of like, I'm kind of amazed there haven't been more and that they haven't been worse. And that's what we keep finding. I point out that basically the radiation that escapes from these accidents, just not the super potent toxin that people imagine. There's not very much of it because of the high power densities, meaning that it's just, nuclear fuel rods, as opposed to coal and wood, you're just putting a lot of material, particulate matter into the environment. Very little of that escapes from nuclear. So the overreaction to those accidents is displacement. It's one of the reactors melted and like 3 Mile Island. And it's like, wow, okay, yeah, and there's that kind of, we knew that would happen. And it was like, this is a first generation. And then like, did anybody, so how many people were killed in this major industrial accident? Oh, nobody. So, okay, Fukushima, how many people were killed with radiation there? Oh, nobody. Chernobyl, you kind of dig down into it. At best, you can kind of count 200 dead bodies over like an 80-year period. So ultimately, nothing, if you believe that science, and I document it all in the book, I have the best expert on it, blah, 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 then something else is going on. And clearly the bomb is a big part of that. Now it's more progressives than conservatives who are worried about nuclear. It's more women than men, so there's other things going on there. But nonetheless, I think that's the big animating factor that freaks us out about the technology.
So my understanding of nuclear plants in the United States, at the very least, and I think this may be true in Europe as well, is that they really, once they're up and running, if you can assume a plant has been built and is running, it's incredibly cost effective compared to carbon or oil, gas, things like that. But that it takes an enormous amount of subsidies to put a plant in operation. Is that accurate, or how would you address that?
No, it's not. They're not subsidies. There are. I guess you could argue that loan guarantees are a subsidy, but it doesn't have to be with subsidies. It can also just be under the traditional regulated public utility model, where you have a natural monopoly in the form of electric company, because you don't want more than one electric company stringing up wires everywhere. It's a natural monopoly. We said we're going to it's either going to be socialist. 30% of U.S. electricity is socialist, basically publicly owned utilities. 70% is privately owned. It's similar to that in Japan, but South Korea, France, and many other countries are just publicly owned utilities. And so when they invest, they don't usually need a subsidy. They usually just need to be able to start charging for some of that electricity in advance in order to make the capital that they borrow cheaper. So the most important thing is that you have cheap capital. But it's like what you said. It's like, if you think that this is important to the civilization, and again, I'm not suggesting that if we don't do it, that the civilization is in deep threat from climate change. I'm actually just sort of criticizing that. Nonetheless, if you think and there's that nuclear is something that you need for civilization, it's just like building a bridge or a highway or a stadium or anything like that. And there's cost overruns, just like there are with those things. You expand the subway, you do the big dig in Boston, you do the high-speed rail in Britain, and those things have cost overruns. But there's no need for, unless it's what would basically happen was with deregulation, it made it harder to be able to do the kind of investments that we did with nuclear in the 1970s. But we're still able to. We don't really have we're just not really set up right to do it.
I guess as a closing thought, are you optimistic that that the kind of high water mark, I'm reaching for bad metaphors here, high water mark, fever, the high fever, whatever, of kind of environmental alarmism, is that cresting, or do you see that cresting sometime soon? How optimistic are you that the message that you're putting out in your book, Apocalypse Never, is going to carry the day?
I mean, I think after Apocalypse Never and some of the stuff that we're going to do to call out the really bad science, I think it's going to be increasingly hard to claim that climate change is causing natural disasters, that it will increase deaths from natural disasters in the future. I think that climate change will eventually have the same trajectory as fears of overpopulation had, which is that it will continue to sort of be something that people say and talk about, but it won't have the kind of, it won't be what the next AOC is crusading on. I do think the left will keep coming around on nuclear. I just hired Zion Lights from Extinction Rebellion, who's the person that is in the book, to help us to build nuclear plants in Britain. But I think the point I would make is that until there's some alternative religion, until there's like some national, I mean, whether it's nationalism or socialism or some alternative to the traditional Judeo-Christianity, people are going to keep finding new religions because we need that. So, I mean, for me, the question is, what would the alternative religion? I would argue in some sense, libertarian is a kind of, spiritual, existential, moral worldview. What I'm proposing, environmental humanism, is the same. But I do think that in some ways there's just the work of Sisyphus that we do have to keep, confronting apocalyptic millenarian ideologies, because they are harmful. I mean, they're contributing to anxiety and depression in people. It's being used as a strategy to basically keep poor countries from accessing cheap energy and thus economic growth. So for me, it's more like, I don't know. I can't tell you exactly how big our victory will be, but I do think the work is essential, and you've got to kind of push back on this stuff so it doesn't cause the kind of harm that it's been causing in recent years.
I'm thinking with the myth of Sisyphus, if we could only harness the energy of that boulder rolling down the hill every night, we wouldn't need carbon, right? Yeah.
Right.
We'll leave it there. The book is Apocalypse Never, Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All. The author is Michael Schellenberger. Mike, thanks so much for talking to Reason.
Thanks for having me, Nick. Good to see you.
We're like, the world is going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change.
To avert the worst consequences of climate crisis. We have 9 years left.
We're going to pass the point of no return within the next 8 to 10 years.
You've probably heard the claim that we have a dozen years or less to stop climate change from inflicting permanent damage on the planet.
We've already waited too long to deal with this climate crisis. We can't wait any longer.
President Biden cited the deadline when announcing that the U.S. would rejoin the Paris Climate Accord, an international agreement to curb greenhouse gases.
I'm signing today an executive order to supercharge our administration's ambitious plan to confront the existential threat of climate change. It is an existential threat. And we're told by all the leading scientists in the world we don't have much time.
I read the report that the people claiming a 2030 deadline are relying upon, and they have misread it.
Aaron Brown is a mathematician and statistician who was taught at NYU and UCSD. He's also the former chief risk officer at the hedge fund AQR Capital Management. Brown says that activists and politicians are misrepresenting the science in a rush to implement unwise solutions.
I am here to say our house is on fire. We must change almost everything in our current societies.
Rather than protecting the most at-risk ecosystems and populations, these proposals are likely to backfire and cause further harm both to the environment and to the most vulnerable people on the planet.
Whether you think climate change is an existential issue, or merely one of several important threats we face in the future, is a completely separate issue from how quickly we should act. People pushing a 2030 deadline are committing us to very risky solutions that could backfire. Based on all the evidence, I think we have more time. We can consider reasonable solutions that don't risk the economy and don't risk the planet, and that people will actually stick to for the long term.
I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic.
So where did the claim that we have until 2030 come from? Among the first to popularize it was teenage climate activist Greta Thunberg, who in speaking before the UN chastised world leaders for their inaction.
People are suffering. People are dying. And all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?
Thunberg took the 2030 deadline from a 2018 special report by the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, authored by the world's top climate scientists and widely considered the gold standard in the field.
This is a report that was actually asked for by governments under the Paris Agreement. They're going to get together in Poland later in the year to talk about the next steps, and our report is the only named input into their negotiations.
Many politicians, activists, and journalists like Thunberg have cited the report as the basis for their claim starting in 2018 that there were just 12 years to save the planet, or that 2030 was a cliff.
Reports that came out from the leading scientists in this world who told us that we have 12 years.
The scientists are absolutely unanimous on this, that we have no more than 12 years.
Scientists tell us, we've said 1,000 times, all of us could be at a point of no return.
But after the IPCC report was released, prominent climate scientists, including some of the report's authors, publicly raised doubts about the 2030 deadline. The panel did not say that we have 12 years left to save the world, IPCC Working Group co-chair James Skia told the Associated Press. The hotter it gets, the worse it gets, but there is no cliff edge. Please stop saying something globally bad is going to happen in 2030, wrote fellow leading report author Miles Allen. The IPCC does not draw a planetary boundary at 1.5 degrees Celsius, beyond which lie climate dragons. All the time-limited frames are bullshit, NASA's Gavin Schmidt told Axios.
We are less than 12 years away from not being able to undo our mistakes. These numbers aren't anyone's opinions or political views. This is the current best available science.
Did climate activists misread the report, or was it a purposeful attempt to mislead the public? That's not clear, but the IPCC report does use vague language that made it susceptible to misinterpretation. The foreword, for example, states that without a, quote, sharp decline in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, there will be irreversible loss of the most fragile ecosystems, and crisis after crisis for the most vulnerable people and societies.
The fall off a cliff idea is not supported by the IPCC report. It's true that risks increase as temperatures ratchet up, but there's no sudden tipping point where climate change becomes irreversible. Properly read, the report is actually an argument for predictable, sustainable solutions over several decades using experimentation and innovation, not a rush toward risky short-term solutions that focus entirely on warming to the detriment of general environmental stewardship.
So what does the IPCC report say about the year 2030? The most specific claim it makes is that, quote, global warming is likely to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius between 2030 and 2052 if it continues to increase at the current rate. There isn't a scientific consensus that reaching 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels will mean global catastrophe, but let's assume that the activists are correct that staying under that level should be the goal of public policy. When will we hit 1.5 degrees of warming under the author's assumptions? By calculating the current rate of global warming and plotting it out along a graph, we see that the answer to the question they pose is the year 2052. But remember that they gave a 22-year range starting in 2030 and ending in 2052. How did they get there? The 2030 date that activists have trumpeted appears in this chart in the report. In the worst-case scenario, or the top of the shaded area, we see that warming hits 1.5 degrees by the year 2030. In the best-case scenario, or the bottom of the shaded area, we see that warming actually never hits 1.5 degrees. But what most commentators haven't paid attention to is that this is not a measure of actual warming. This chart is actually showing estimates of anthropogenic warming, or warming that the authors hypothesize is caused by humans. The gray line shows the actual changes in the planet's surface temperatures, and the orange shaded area represents the author's estimates of what humans are contributing to the overall warming trend. So the worst case scenario that gets us to 1.5 degrees by 2030 does not represent actual temperature increases, but the upper limit of how much the authors think humans could possibly be contributing if our activities were happening in isolation. So what explains the difference between actual global warming and the global warming caused by humans? The authors believe that if anthropogenic warming is up here, there must be a naturally occurring cooling force that has brought temperatures down. If human-caused warming is down here, that means there's been a naturally occurring warming effect that has brought temperatures up. They aren't sure which is happening, which is why they're not sure whether global warming caused by humans is up here or down there. The point is that the 2030 date, as it appeared in the IPCC report, was the worst-case scenario not in terms of actual global warming, but in terms of warming caused only by humans, independent of what's actually happening in the environment.
People making the sky is falling claims probably haven't read the report and think that it's saying actual temperatures will increase by 1.5 degrees in 2030. The range of dates the report discusses are actually about human contribution to global warming. If you think the problem of global warming is higher temperatures, melting ice caps, rising sea levels, then you care about the date the report projects actual temperatures will reach 1.5 degrees, which is 2052 if things continue at the current rate.
Is it possible that actual warming could result in baseline temperatures above 1.5 degrees by 2030? The rate of global warming would have to speed up to about 3 times what we have observed in past decades, which no serious climate scientists, including the authors of the IPCC report, claim is likely to happen. So why did the IPCC report focus on a date which is the worst case scenario not in terms of actual global warming, but of human contributions to warming, as if they were happening in a vacuum? After the report's release, co-chair of the working group Deborah Roberts justified their presentation of the data and conclusions as an effort to project a line in the sand, and what it says to our species that this is the moment and we must act now, and I hope it mobilizes people and dents the mood of complacency. But Brown says that distorting the science is the opposite of what the IPCC authors and other climate scientists should be doing.
It's a very dangerous game if you want strong, sensible long-term solutions to climate change to scare people into them by making wild short-term predictions. That can backfire in one of 2 ways. You may scare people into doing short-term irrational solutions that do more harm than good, or 2030 might roll around and it's not as much warmer as you said it was going to be, and you could take a lot of steam out of the movement to do anything at all.
If we were to accept 2030 as a meaningful deadline, the only path forward is politically unfeasible, economically devastating, and immensely risky. According to the IPCC, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees would require rapid and far-reaching transitions in land, energy, industry, buildings, transport, and cities, all taking place in under a decade. Emissions reductions as currently envisioned won't work. Supporters of the Paris Climate Accord acknowledge that if fully implemented, it still won't come close to keeping warming under its goal of 1.5 degrees.
Even if we did everything that we said we were going to do when we signed up in Paris, we would see a rise in the Earth's temperature, which is catastrophic.
Just reducing emissions is not enough. Our greenhouse gas emissions has to stop. 0 in 2050 means nothing if high emission continues even for a few years.
They're not thinking through the implications of what they're calling for. If we need a solution by 2030, that means geoengineering and other dramatic, untested strategies with unpredictable effects.
Investing millions of jobs in wind, solar, and carbon capture.
The supposed 2030 deadline has become a justification for diverting massive resources into largely unproven direct carbon capture and geoengineering projects, and at the same time for shutting down much of the global economy.
People who really believe 2030 is a disaster year have to focus on geoengineering, scattering beads to reflect sunlight, injecting aerosols in the stratosphere. Rushing these things through without proper testing has entirely unpredictable consequences and could backfire to much worse environmental damage than the problem they're intended to solve. The only other thing that works on this horizon is bans. We ban coal, we ban air travel, we shut down many electrical power plants. And mainly we have to do it in China and India. This has unpredictable economic effects, except we know it will cause a considerable decline in gross domestic product. That means we reverse the rise out of poverty for much of the world. And we create economic problems larger than we got in the great financial crisis of 2008, and they're permanent.
But what if, as the report's underlying data suggest, we actually have more time to limit global warming to below catastrophic levels?
If we have 30 years to address climate change, then we have much more palatable options. First of all, the economy and technology are naturally moving away from fossil fuels. Then we can give entrepreneurship and bottom-up innovation a time to work. We can adopt policies that gently nudge the economy in the right direction without creating the disruption and misery of sudden bans. If we have more time, we can get away from the pure focus on temperature. We can consider balanced solutions that consider all environmental issues and all economic issues. We can try to reduce the total human environmental impact. Sensible solutions can build a better world for our grandchildren.
Scientists tell us that this is the decisive decade.
We no longer have time to leave out the science.
Activists, politicians, and journalists who trumpet 2030 as a meaningful deadline may be doing so in a desperate attempt to get the public to take the threat of global warming seriously.
This is our World War II. I feel a need for all of us to breathe fire.
After New York Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez invoked the 12-year deadline, she responded to critics by tweeting, "You'd have to have the social intelligence of a sea sponge to think it's literal." But the best way to address climate change is not to mislead people and stoke panic, but to rationally assess the science and chart the best course for both the planet and the people living on it.
There's a partisan divide on this issue between people who think it's a very serious problem with a short fuse and people who think it's not much of a problem with a long fuse. I think most sensible people should regard it as a serious problem with a long fuse. There isn't much place for this in the media and on campaign trails. The key factor is for the last 50 years, we have been reducing the amount of energy it takes to create a dollar of wealth. If that trend continues and can be accelerated, it means we can have a booming economy, we can have prosperity for all, we can bring people out of poverty all over the world without using a lot of energy and therefore without a big environmental footprint. We don't have to choose between prosperity and a good environment. We can have both.